WisconsinEye's Campaign 2024 programming is sponsored by Wisconsin Counties Association, Nicolet National Bank, Wisconsin Hospital Association, Operating Engineers Local 139, the Wisconsin Realtors Association, the Wisconsin Laborers District Council, and North Central State's Regional Council of Carpenters. To support programs like this, please consider a tax-deductible donation at wiseye.org/donate or by texting WisEye to 44321.
Rebecca Witherspoon from DeForest is the Republican candidate for the 42nd Assembly District. The election is November 5th. Rebecca Witherspoon, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for participating in our candidate interviews. What is your campaign's key message and why are you running for this office?
You know, there's been a lot going on over the past number of years. Currently, I'm a trustee in DeForest, and I just feel like there's more I can help with. We've got a problem with the education outcomes. We've got a problem with our taxation, big spending problems. And we've also got some issues with crime that all need to be addressed. And I've got some experience in all of those areas, which I feel I can really be beneficial to the state for.
So if you're elected, what's an example of a bill that would be a priority for you to introduce?
One of my big priorities is hopefully to introduce a bill very early on to help our seniors and our disabled veterans. One of the ideas that I've come up with through talking with various people is trying to get a freeze on their property taxes. I've seen too many people being taxed out of their home of late. And these people have worked hard all of their life. They've served our country, and they deserve to be safe and secure in their homes and not have to fear that their government's going to force them out of it. So that's one of my first priorities.
So if you're elected, you'd be entering the legislature during a biennial budget year. The state's projected to have more than a $3 billion surplus. What would be your top two priorities for use of that surplus?
Top two priorities, excuse me. The first one, obviously, would be we're obviously taxing too much. So I would like to see at least a portion of that money go back to the people in some way. But short of that, the other option would be some one-time expenditures that aren't part of operational expenses because we don't want to futz with those. But things like rural roads and the infrastructure as far as like our sewer upgrades and maintenance of those, because some of these roads and sewer systems are in really bad repair, and the sewer systems can't handle the growth as fast as things are growing. And our rural communities really need help. Our cities, I mean, they need help too, but I'm really focused on our more rural communities that really kind of get ignored.
You mentioned tax cuts as a priority. Give me some more information on that. Who would get a tax cut under your platform?
Well, especially our most vulnerable communities. Our seniors, are disabled, but that middle class portion of our economy or of our communities, they get hit the hardest. They get hit by not just regular taxes, but they get hit by the hidden taxes like inflation. You know, the increase in the cost of everything. There's people, including my daughter, who hasn't been able to buy a home because right as they were getting ready to buy a home, they had an accepted offer. They were going through the process of getting the financing, and that's when the rates just went through the roof, and they had to back out. So things like that just really are affecting our middle income people, the working class that don't have that spare income to really be able to buffer those hard times.
Sure. K-12 education is a leading issue for many voters. You talked a little bit about education outcomes as a concern, but what is your campaign's top priority for K-12 education?
It's kind of a threefold thing. One is making sure that there's disproportionate funding for all of our, across the board throughout the state for the different school districts. You have some school districts that have a really healthy amount per child, and then you have some school districts, they're barely meeting the stated requirements for funding for their children. And this puts unfair disadvantage to certain school districts, and we need to get that across. My personal opinion is we need to get that equalized.
Change the funding system?
Change the funding system so that it's equalized across all school districts. That's one priority. I think that then you can see, okay, is it funding that is an issue, or is it actually something different? Because you always hear funding, funding, funding. We need more money, but then you don't see the results in the education outcomes. And one of the things that I have been really disturbed by is the fact that they're lowering education outcome standards. And I'm like, excuse me, why are you doing that? You need to be teaching the children and bringing them up to the standards, not lowering the standards because you're not meeting the requirements of educating our kids. So that's one big thing.
Sounds like more accountability?
Yeah, and more accountability. We need to get our kids life ready. And they're coming out, some kids aren't even graduating high school, and that's a real travesty. And these kids need to know, they need to know math, they need to know English, they need to know how to write, they need to know how to communicate, they need to know how to think for themselves. And they're not, I mean, some schools do well, but some schools are really struggling in this area. What's the root cause of that? We need to figure that out, and we need to solve this problem.
What about the future of Wisconsin's higher education system? 4-year colleges, 2-year colleges, technical colleges. What does that future look like to you, and what is the legislature's role in that?
Well, the cost of education has absolutely skyrocketed. There's kids that are coming out of the higher education schools with incredible debt. So that's a real issue, but not everybody needs the 4-year education to be able to get a really, really good paying job and career. We have technical schools, we have apprenticeships, and I think we really need to help boost those, especially our high school students. We need to make sure that employers, the regulations surrounding apprenticeships for high school students, that we can incentivize them so that they can offer more of those for our high school students. I was talking with some folks just recently about this, and these programs are vital. And sometimes these people, they don't want that 4-year education. They just want to come out of school. They want to go right into a career. They know what they want to do, and these technical schools and apprenticeships are some of the best that I've ever seen, and we have some really great ones here in the state. But
are you supportive of more funding for the Universities of Wisconsin system?
It depends. They have so many endowments right now, and they have a lot of funding. I mean, they're doing some great things. I'm not going to knock them. I don't have anything against them at all. But if we're funding them the way we're funding them, and kids are still coming out with sometimes $100,000 worth of debt, there's an issue. There's something broken there, and something needs to be fixed. I would like to see how things are being done. And right now, I'm not privy to behind the curtain. I want to see what's going on to be able to figure out, okay, what can be done to help this broken system work better. Because people didn't used to have this type of debt, and it's only been in the, past 20 to 30 years that it's really just skyrocketed.
What do you see as the state's largest workforce development challenge, and how would you propose to address it?
That's a really tough question to answer. there's a lot of different factors going on. We've got lack of people who are in the workforce, right, or even in looking for a job. That's one issue. We've got a lack of people who are qualified for some of the jobs that are available. And so we need some better education, ways of being able to make sure that our workforce is ready for these types of jobs. We need to deregulate some things, or deregulate is not quite what I'm trying to say. Look at the regulations and maybe streamline them so that they're not so oppressive.
For certifications? For
certifications, but I'm thinking more in terms of the employer side, because some of these regulations are really onerous and some of them really aren't needed. So I think looking at those, streamlining those, making it easier for the employers so that, they're paying a lot of money for a lot of these regulations before they ever get a chance to even hire somebody. So there's a lot going on there, a lot that needs to be looked at. And
sure. Another workforce question for you. Investments in public and energy infrastructure grow our state's economy. They also provide an opportunity to invest in our state's workforce, but currently there are no requirements for hiring local workers. Would you support a state resident hiring requirement for state, local, and utility scale infrastructure investments?
Requirement, no. Preference, yes. Requirement, no, because it stifles being able to get the right person for the right job. If we don't have the workforce in our state to be able to fill these positions, that's telling us something. And if we're having to reach out to folks outside of our state, that's telling us something. We need to fix our education system so that we have the workforce. We also need to make sure that the pay for these different types of jobs is such that it's attracting people to actually stay in our state when they get done with their education.
Employee classification is an issue in the construction industry. Some employers misclassify workers as independent contractors or pay them in cash off the books. This lowers costs by avoiding payroll taxes and unemployment insurance, and it puts compliant companies at a disadvantage when bidding on projects. Plus, misclassified workers may be denied minimum wage protections or overtime pay. Are you aware of this, and what do you think should be done about it?
Yes, I'm aware of it. It is a problem. It is something that needs to be dealt with. That said, we have those people that are those companies, those individuals who are breaking laws, they need to be held accountable. That's first and foremost. But that said, we also need to, again, look at the regulations that are on some of these businesses. Why are these businesses thinking that that's the only way that they can get or be able to afford to hire somebody? Is the regulatory system so onerous that it's forcing them, or they feel they're being forced into that position? So that's one thing. But the other thing is, I'm not against independent contractors. I love entrepreneurship. And there's a lot of people that don't want to be tied as an employee to a particular company, but they want to be able to be free to work for this company, and do contract work. And I think that these people need to be allowed to negotiate with employers for those types of positions. But it does need to be above board. It does need to be done properly. People do need to be classified properly when they truly are. So, for instance, if you're required to be at a meeting, you're no longer an independent. If you're required to be at a certain type of training, you're no longer an independent. So there's different ways of being able to identify when somebody is truly an independent and when they're not an independent. And we need to really take a look at that.
Moving on to housing. Affordable rental housing is an issue in Wisconsin. Some support government-imposed rent control to maintain affordability, while others argue keeping rent artificially low will decrease rental supply, resulting in increased prices. What is your sense of housing as an issue and which best addresses rental housing affordability? Rent control or building more rentals or other?
Not rent controls. I am absolutely against rent controls. I think that's very anti-American, and I would never support that. However, again, going back to regulations, the housing industry, before you can build a house, you have so much or any type of development for that matter, you have so much regulation for just a home that before you ever even break ground, sometimes the cost of the permits, the regulations, the requirements and all that can boost the price up to $100,000 or more just before you break ground. That's not right. We need to streamline these, make it a little bit easier, make it more reasonable for the regulations. I'm not saying we don't need the regulations. We need standards, okay, because we need to make sure our homes are safe, that the buildings are safe. But there's things that can be streamlined. We need to revisit some of these things and make sure that those things are appropriate. And as you do that, that will help to increase the housing supply just naturally, because now developers will be able to afford to build more. Families will be able to build a home or purchase a new construction. So as you do that, supply will increase, pricing will decrease.
Moving on to healthcare. Medical systems are facing numerous headwinds in the form of inflation, workforce development, and issues around Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement, resulting in fewer services and even the closure of a hospital system in western Wisconsin. What would you do to preserve access to care and prevent future closures?
You know, that's a really good question. I was thinking about that, and that's a real problem in our rural communities. Some communities don't even have or some counties don't even have a hospital. Now, whether or not they need a hospital, that's debatable. It depends on proximity to how close is the next hospital. But the real question is, do they have access to quality health care in other forms, okay? And if they do need to get to a hospital, how are they going to be able to get to that hospital? There's things like telemedicine, partnerships with our bigger, like the UW system, partnerships with them to be able to put a small clinic or even a mobile clinic that comes on a regular basis but isn't necessarily stationed there full time.
So do you see the legislature incentivizing those sorts
Absolutely.
of things?
I think that's something that the state definitely, I mean, this is a common need across the state. It's not just one community that needs it versus another. This is a common need for everybody, and that's, I think, something where the state definitely has a role in helping.
What about mental health care? A growing concern for Wisconsinites, for state and county budgets. What are you hearing on this issue, and what are the solutions?
Solutions, it's an ongoing issue. As far as being able to solve the problem, one, you need to identify where the issues are primarily happening, the types of issues. Is it so for instance, we have a lot of homeless folks here in the Madison area. I work here in the downtown area. And we have a lot of folks that are homeless, and a good number of them have some mental health issues. So they don't have some of the access to things that other people might have access to. So like a mom might have access to a mental health provider for her child or herself or whatever. But some of these folks, we need to identify where the issues are primarily happening and then determine what those issues are, and then incentivize workers, mental health workers, into those areas where those problems are primarily happening. If we're having them in the schools, then we need to identify which schools are actually having the problems.
Support increased funding for those sort of
priorities?
priorities?
Absolutely, I do.
What about abortion policy? How should the state move forward on abortion?
That's a very controversial question for which I don't have an absolute answer for you.
Do you support a week limit for abortion?
I can say this. I am for life. I'm not afraid to say that. We have a highly educated society with advanced scientific knowledge, and we are relying on some very controversial ways to deal with unplanned pregnancies. Why? There are so many ways that we can help people who find themselves in these situations besides terminating a pregnancy. You know, if it's...
Should there be exceptions?
Oh, absolutely, there should be exceptions.
What kind of exceptions do you support?
The typical ones: rape, incest, the life of the mother. But those are not the typical things that happen. Right now, it's a go-to method for birth control, and that there's an issue with that. Why are we not introducing education for how to avoid an unwanted pregnancy in the first place? That's your best method right there. But
moving on to transportation, what are the pressing transportation needs in your district, and how important is it that those are addressed, and for the state to keep on schedule with reconstruction of aging interstates and significant corridors of commerce?
Our roads have been incredibly neglected, and especially in our more rural areas. They're kind of the last man on the totem pole to be even thought of, until they're at a point where they can't be ignored anymore. And that's a real shame, because our farmers absolutely, the roads are their lifeblood. If they can't move the products from one place to another in a safe manner, that affects our food supply. That affects their bottom line. That affects the safety on the roads themselves. In my particular district, that's an issue. But I would also say, because part of my district is more urban, DeForest, Windsor, Burke, we need to find a way to extend that transportation corridor into Madison, or from Madison out to us, because we have workers that live one place and they need to be able to get to another place, and not everybody can afford a car.
What about the environment? PFAS, water contaminants are a concern for a growing number of Wisconsinites. How would you address that issue?
We need to make sure that we're keeping our water supply clean. I am absolutely in favor of making sure that it happens. We need to have reasonable, scientifically based regulations to make sure that our water is clean. When we find things that are happening in a particular area, it needs to be identified as to the source of the problem, and then that needs to be dealt with. Now, if it's a business that's doing it, I'm sorry. If they're doing it, if they knew that this was happening, they need, or even if they didn't, they need to be held accountable for that.
Last two questions. Mm-hmm. How would you describe the leading differences between you and your opponent?
Significant. I'm very fiscally conservative, as far as I'm very responsible with the people's money. It is the people's money. It's not my money. My opponent has a long track record of taxing, and even in the hardest of times, increasing those taxes, and which results in people losing their homes. I trust the people to know the best way to raise their kids and to spend their money. She seems to want to dictate how you raise your kids and how you spend your money. I protect people's rights. I'm an absolute advocate for our constitutional rights. She has had a tendency to trample those rights. And lastly, but probably most significant, is as far as crime and law enforcement support. I am an absolute supporter of our law enforcement, and we need to make sure that they're enabled to do their job. She's co-sponsored several resolutions at the Dane County Board that has made our Dane County a sanctuary to avoid laws and to avoid supporting our cops.
Last question. If you're elected this fall, you get a magic wand you can use in the state capitol on one issue to resolve it in a way that brings all parties together. What is that issue?
That our schools would be turning out kids who are life ready, that they're ready to move forward with their life, that they're graduating at a high rate, and that it's not because we lowered the standards, but because the education system brought them up to it.
All right. Rebecca Witherspoon from DeForest, the Republican candidate for the 42nd Assembly District. The election is November 5th. Rebecca Witherspoon, thank you for talking with WisconsinEye.
Thank you.
This programming is brought to you by our generous sponsors. Thank you for watching.